In this lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the Second Great Awakening, which was the precursor for the reform movements of the antebellum period. Now, in order to introduce you to the Second Great Awakening, let's talk first about the First Great Awakening, which hopefully you remember from your studies of colonial America. The First Great Awakening was a religious revival in the 1730s and 1740s. It was known for emotional fire and brimstone preaching. Lots of talk about hell in the sermons, specifically you being there. You're going to hell. This is something that both Great Awakenings have in common, a wake-up call, so to speak. Jonathan Edwards was the most famous preacher of the First Great Awakening with his sermon entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." Edwards and other First Great Awakening preachers were influenced by Calvinism. John Calvin taught the doctrine of the sovereignty of God and that human sinfulness was inherent. And the only way that some people were going to get to heaven was because God had chosen his elect. He had certain people that he'd chosen who, without his help, had a total inability to be saved. In short, there's really nothing you can do about your eternal salvation except be afraid. The Second Great Awakening was a religious revival that peaked in the 1820s and 1830s. The setting for the Second Great Awakening was really in rural areas. You had itinerant preachers. Itinerant preachers were traveling preachers. They didn't have a set church. For example, when you travel, you have an itinerary. This is what you're supposed to do at this time, this time, this time, and this time. And these itinerant preachers would often find themselves at camp meetings, which were literally camp meetings. People in these rural areas would go and pitch tents, and they would hear this hellfire and brimstone preaching. Keep in mind that this is the day before iPhones, the internet, cable and satellite TV, and all of the things that keep us entertained now. Hearing some revival preaching, this was about as much entertainment as these people in these rural areas would ever see. Here's a picture of a Methodist camp meeting from the Second Great Awakening. And as we can see, we've got a preacher here on the platform. Looks like he might be doing disco or something, but knowing the context, more than likely he is yelling at these people about their eternal destiny below. And look at the response of the people. They are swooning. They are reacting emotionally. These people are afraid. The fear of God has been beaten into them. And they are told that you have a choice. So far, you are making a choice to go to hell. You need to make a choice otherwise. All good things come to an end. Charles G. Finney, one of the most famous revival preachers of the Second Great Awakening, referred to an area in upstate New York as the burned over district. Burned over because when he preached at these people, normally if somebody tells you you're going to burn in hell for an eternity, you would think that you would get an emotional reaction, tears, yelling, maybe fainting. At the point where you go and you tell somebody, you're going to hell! And they laugh, they giggle. In my classes, a lot of times, the students laugh. They think it's a joke. Some of them just sit there and look at me like I'm crazy. These people have been burned over. The hellfire preaching has just dried them up. They've had too much of it. The Second Great Awakening was dominated not by Calvinism, but by the philosophy of Arminianism, named for Jacobus Arminius, a Dutch Reformed theologian. Whereas John Calvin's theology emphasized the sovereignty of God, predestination, that salvation depends on you being elected by God. Arminius taught that God really wanted everyone to go to heaven. and he offers people a choice. He offers his grace, but it is up to you whether you accept it or reject it. Does that sound familiar? If it does, that's because it's what most evangelical denominations teach today in America. Salvation or damnation? Your choice. Arminian preaching focused on a conversion experience. As an example of this, we're going to look at a sermon by Charles G. Finney on the topic of reprobation. What is reprobation, you might ask? What is a reprobate? No one's ever called me that before. Good. That means you're probably a decent human being. A reprobate is somebody that's no good. Somebody that you wouldn't want your daughter going on a date with, or your son hanging out with, or something like that. Let's take a look at this sermon on reprobation, and let's find out why the people that Finney is talking to are so reprobated. What are the reasons, Finney asked, why reprobates are rejected and lost? Because they are unwilling to be saved. That is, they are unwilling to be saved on the terms upon which alone God can consistently save them. Ask sinners whether they are willing to be saved, and they all say yes. And with perfect sincerity, they may say this: we all want to go to heaven, right? But Finney says, we all want to go to heaven if we can do it our way. That's not the way to get to heaven, as we'll find out. Let's keep reading. Now, to accept these terms is heartily and practically to consent to them. The only true reason that any of you are not Christians is that you are unwilling. You are not made unwilling by any act of God because you are a reprobate. But if you are a reprobate, it is because you are unwilling. The only thing stopping you from being saved is a choice to accept the means of salvation that God has provided you with. Something that is within your power. Doesn't that sound American? After all, the idea of being American is about being able to make choices. And being able to make choices about one's eternal salvation sounds very American, very democratic. So Finney here teaches that in order to be saved, someone needs to have a true willingness to be saved. Let's take a look at a wordle. I love wordles, by the way, if you haven't noticed. In this sermon on reprobation, of course, Finney needs to remind his audience that they are reprobated. They're a bunch of reprobates. Every individual among them is a reprobate, guilty of reprobation. A wicked person on the way to eternal damnation. The focus here is on you, your behavior. Let's compare this to Jonathan Edwards. The focus here is on you, your decision to fly or fry. Let's compare this to Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Here, like in Finney's sermon, we see God. It's a good thing to have in a sermon. And look at the other bold words. We see hand, meaning God's hand, power, God's power, hell, wrath, fierceness, destruction. Then here we see nothing, as in there is nothing you can do but be afraid. And this is a contrast in the message of the first and the second Great Awakening, that on one hand, you need to fear God. On the other hand, you still need to fear God, but you can make a choice about your eternal salvation. God has not made that for you. God has not made you wicked. You have made yourself wicked, and you need to unmake it quick, preferably before you die. And this emphasis on the conversion experience brings about the growth of non-traditional religious sects, such as Baptist and Methodist. We see that before 1820, Baptist and Methodist weren't really much larger than anyone else. They'd seen some growth around the time of the Revolution, but look after 1820 how both of those faiths skyrocket. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense because these faiths that emphasize a conversion experience are very democratic. If any of you have ever been to a Baptist service, at the end of the service, after the sermon, the preacher offers you an opportunity to make a choice. You can decide not to be a reprobate anymore. Your salvation is in your own hands. It's just a choice away. Let's compare the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. Let's start with the obvious. They were both religious revivals. And they both emphasized emotional fire and brimstone preaching. Now remember that the First Great Awakening had a heavy Calvinist influence, focusing on the inherent sinfulness of human beings, while the Second Great Awakening was more influenced by Arminian theology, that your sinfulness is a choice and you can make a choice to stop sinning. You can convert within your heart. And both instigated the spread of non-traditional denominations. Keep in mind, Baptist and Methodist are extremely numerous in the United States today, especially here in the South. But before this time, they were both non-traditional denominations. Baptist and Methodist preachers would be willing to go out into rural areas. They called these people circuit riders that would go around baptizing, preaching, praying, performing funerals, and they'd be at a different place all the time. So you'd see this itinerant preacher and he would perform his duties, he would go on to the next village, and he would be back in a few weeks. But he didn't have one church like the pastors in the more established denominations would have. Both of these movements promoted democratic ideals to a certain extent. Some historians hold the First Great Awakening responsible for the American Revolution because it reached out to the dispossessed class as it challenged the traditional church authorities. And the Second Great Awakening is directly responsible for antebellum reform movements such as temperance, abolitionism, and public education. Let's look for a second at the legacies of the Great Awakening. Today, if we look at church attendance in the United States, we see that church attendance is highest in the South. In some states, the majority of the inhabitants attend church regularly, whereas if you go to some places like New Hampshire and Vermont, less than a quarter of families attend church regularly. You see out in the West, church attendance is much lower than the rest of the country. Utah, of course, is an exception, but that is because of the heavy Mormon influence. As we'll talk about in another lecture, Mormonism is a product of the Second Great Awakening. Joseph Smith grew up in the burned-over district of upstate New York. And let's look also at the plurality of religious preference. We can see in the South very heavily Baptist. The South, which has not received nearly as much of the post-Civil War new immigration as other parts of the country have. So you see that in most places the plurality is Catholic, the religion that more people profess than any other religion. But in the South, that's not the case. And that about does it for the Second Great Awakening. This religious movement that still continues to influence us today. I'll follow up with some discussion of reform movements that branched off of this, such as abolitionism and temperance. Stay tuned.